Thanks, Juliana. Good evening, everybody. It's so cool to see so many people here. I know this is a tricky hour for a lot of folks because it's kiddo dinner time and so forth. So thank you so much for joining this evening. As Juliana said, my name is Vivian Van Gelder, and I am a parent here in Seattle. I have two kiddos in SPS, of a 4th grader and a 9th grader, and they're both at school in the Central District. I'm an attorney by training, and I mentioned that because when I first got into the material that I'm going to talk a little about tonight, I was sort of a frustrated professional stay-at-home mom, so a lot of this started out as a hobby and then just kind of snowballed. So I've been digging into this stuff for about 7 years now. I'm by no means an expert, but just like to give these presentations just to kind of get people thinking and give you an idea of what's out there, because I know this was a mystery to me when I first started looking into it. And I have also served on PTAs at the elementary level, the middle school level, and now on Seattle Council PTSA since pretty much continuously since 2015. So tonight, just to give you an overview, I'm going to apologize in advance. I have a lot of slides, but I will go through them relatively quickly. I read somewhere that 10 is kind of the limit. I have a lot more than that, but I promise they'll go quick. So I'm going to start with a little description of, what PTA is, what our mission is, very little about the history, and specifically about what the PTA organization says about fundraising and the role of fundraising in PTA. Then I'm going to turn very briefly to what the fundraising landscape, the PTA fundraising landscape looks like in Seattle. And then I'm going to talk about what kind of advocacy we might want to start looking at around fundraising and why it happens. And usually when you attend a presentation, you're hoping to come away with a lot of information, and I hope that there will be some useful information in here for you tonight, but I also am hoping that you come away with maybe more questions than answers, because this is an area where there are a lot of questions and we don't yet have a lot of answers. So on that note, I will dive in. And okay. So as I'm coming as a representative of PTA at the organization, I like to start this conversation by just locating us within the mission of PTA, because I was on a PTA for maybe 3 or 4 years before I had any idea of what the mission of PTA was. And this is the official mission of PTA. The mission is to make every child's potential a reality by engaging and empowering families and communities to advocate for all children. So we're primarily an advocacy organization. That is what we do. And you can have, your PTA may have a different mission written down somewhere, and that's totally fine, as long as it's consistent with this mission. So PTA is a nationwide organization, and every local PTA is part of that bigger PTA. So we are required to all have the same mission, even if it's written a little differently. And this is the mission. Just a really brief background on the history of PTA. PTA has been around for over 125 years now. It was founded at a time when women could not vote. And it was a way for women, and particularly mothers, to have an impact on the politics of the day, specifically in connection with children and the rights of children. And of course, children still can't vote. PTA is often called the nation's largest and oldest lobbying organization for children. And because it's important to acknowledge that because schools were segregated at the time when what was then called the National Congress of Parents and Teachers was founded, the organization was also segregated. There was a separate organization called the National Congress of Colored Parents and Teachers for African-American students and families, and they're in the segregated schools. Those two organizations did actually apparently work together on and off for a long time. And in 1970, they did formally merge. So there's now one organization, which is PTA, but that is the history of the organization. And again, the structure is that we have the national PTA as our overarching structure. We get our bylaws from them. We get our mission from them. Under the national PTA, we have state PTAs. Every state in the union and Puerto Rico, I think, have state and territorial PTAs. And then under that level, you have in some bigger cities, you have council PTAs. So we have our Seattle Council PTSA. And then below that level, we have our local units. So if you're coming here tonight, if you're a member of your PTA board, or you're just a general member of your school's PTA, that is the bottom level, but also the front line the most important level of PTA, because that's embedded in the community. And this is a community membership organization. Excuse me. So that said, with that structure in mind, I want to just go over briefly what the PTA as an organization at various levels has said about the role of fundraising in PTA. And I come at it from this angle because often when you mention, perhaps if you're not a member of a PTA or you've talked to someone about PTA who doesn't really know about it, they're like, oh, they're the people that raise money for the school, right? I like to do crosswords, and I was doing a crossword the other day. One of the clues was group that raises money for schools. And I was kind of crushed to see that the answer was PTA. So that's the popular perception of PTA, but the reality, as you'll see, it's just slightly different. So this is what the National PTA tells us about fundraising. First of all, they say that the real working capital of a PTA lies in its members, not in its treasury, and that fundraising is not a primary function of PTA. National PTA actually tells us that the primary source of funds for our PTA operations should be our membership dues. And if you are on a PTA board and you know what that looks like, it's a very small amount of money. And that's because we are an advocacy organization, and advocacy in a democracy is free. Everybody has access to legislators and policymakers, and that's where our organization is meant to sit. Okay. National PTA also says that we as PTAs render a greater service by working to secure adequate funding, so to advocate for funding, than by actually filling holes in funding ourselves. And finally, they say that we as PTA should not contribute to the problem of inequities within a school district by what they call excessive fundraising. And the source of that is a document that they released in 2011 called Appropriate Use of PTA Funds. So that is our national PTA. Our state PTA actually has 2 resolutions that are specifically around fundraising by PTAs. The first is from 2012, and my understanding of the history of this is that this was just as we were coming out of the recession. There had been major cuts to school budgets, and in many districts across Washington, superintendents and principals were asking PTAs to subsidize school staff. That was pretty common. And so a lot of PTAs were coming to the state PTA saying, is this okay? Like, we're not feeling great about this. Can you make a statement so that we know if this is something that we're supposed to be doing? So they then passed this resolution called Subsidizing Certificated and Classified Staff. It's a pretty long resolution, but the whereas part says that our state PTA advises us as local PTAs and councils to use our resources to enhance students' educational experience during this, outside of the school day, rather than by providing resources for staffing inside school during the school day. So, after school enrichment, things like that are okay, but paying for staffing, paying for things inside school, not so great. Does anybody, I can't see the chat, so do I need to slow down or people have questions? Okay, great. So that's our state's first resolution, earlier resolution. They also have this other resolution called the Mission Focused Fundraising Resolution from 2019. And in that, they urge PTAs, local PTAs, to evaluate our current fundraising practices and budgets to make sure that they're aligned with that mission that I mentioned earlier, that we're really spending the bulk of our time engaging our families and communities around advocacy. And also National PTA's other priority that they are trying to push out to local PTAs is family school engagement around student learning, because that is something that research has shown. That's the type of family engagement that has the greatest impact on the students and leads to student success. So those are the 2 things that our national PTA wants us to focus on, is advocacy on the one hand, and then family school engagement around student learning on the other hand. So our state PTA is urging us to look at our budgets and how we fundraise, and perhaps the time that we use to fundraise and how that relates to what we do, the other things that we do, and make sure that those things are proportional to what they should be given our mission. And that resolution also strongly advises us as local PTAs and councils not to, again, they reiterate their earlier resolution, not to fund certificated and classified staff, school operations, or programs that are included in the definition of basic education. And then when we come to the local level, Seattle Council PTSA also in 2019 passed a resolution that's pretty heavily based on the state one, but it does have a very, very long what I would call issue brief at the beginning of it. That's really well worth reading. It's not really part of the resolution, but it's a backgrounder. And if you're interested in the history of fundraising in our district and sort of the dimensions of it and knowing more about it, that's a really good resource to take a look at. And one of us can probably pop that in the chat at some point. Thank you, Juliana. So that resolution describes what they call large-scale fundraising as a distraction from the important work of advocacy. So you'll see this continues the themes of the state and the national resolutions on this issue, and that it exacerbates critical inequities in our system. Our council resolution urged local PTAs to focus on the mission and, again, no longer fund parts of basic education that should be funded by the state. So, again, almost word for word the state one, and closed by urging current and future members to #TakeBackPTA and return to a commitment to community, family, and advocacy. So those are the core commitments of PTA. And coming out of this particular resolution, we as council have actually established what we call a Take Back PTA work group to start doing that work together. And it's really important to note that this is not a criticism of anybody. This is not a kind of gotcha. This is sort of like, this is something that we're all doing. And this is a shift that a lot of PTAs in our city both need and want to make. And how can we come together to support each other to make that shift and make sure that whatever needs that we are meeting or we think that we're meeting through fundraising are still going to be met no matter what we do. Okay, so that's what our every level of PTA, that's what they are telling us about fundraising. First, that we shouldn't really be funding things that are properly the domain of the state to fund. We shouldn't really be funding public education because that's the job of the state. And that we shouldn't be doing this in a way that exacerbates inequities that are already present in our districts. So with that in mind, the next thing I'm going to turn to is what we're actually doing in Seattle. And I want to talk a little bit about what this looks like. And the reason that I've picked the year 2018-19 is because it is very, very difficult to find any accurate information about PTA fundraising anywhere at all, including in Seattle. So the most recent, there's no requirement to report anything about your PTA fundraising to the district. You are, as a nonprofit, so in Washington State, all PTAs are required to be a 501c3, which is a nonprofit recognized by the federal IRS. So you don't pay taxes on your income. The federal government does require that every nonprofit file what's called a Form 990. And if you're on a PTA or have served on a PTA or any nonprofit, you'll be familiar with that document. That also does not require any kind of standard form reporting. So while you can, those are public record information. They aren't, because they're not reported in any standard way, it's very hard to compile a document that, it's very hard to compare spending across categories because it's all reported in a very idiosyncratic way. 2018-19 is significant because it is the last complete, or the most recent complete data set that the IRS has released. So there is not a complete data set of PTA tax returns for any year more recent than 2018-19. And that information is not available anywhere else. So I'm going to hammer that because that's something else I'm going to talk about later on, is the lack of transparency and the lack of insight that we have into this phenomenon. So when we start talking about it, we're coming to this issue with incomplete information. So again, keep in mind that our national, state, and local council PTAs have told us we should not be doing what they call large-scale fundraising, and we should not be putting that money into schools. So this is what we did in 2018-19. So we have 80 PTAs in Seattle and 10 parent groups that are not PTAs. They are 501c3s, but they're not PTAs. They're often referred to as PTOs, parent teacher organizations. They're not part of that official PTA structure. So we have 90 parent groups in Seattle, and between them, they raised $13 million in revenue in 2018-19. Spent 12 million of that. And then at the end of the year, after spending that 12 million, had $13 million in assets. And again, that's roughly, that's because there are often errors in reporting, things are missed out. So it could be more than that. It's definitely not less. And then, so the question is, where is it? So this is what I would call fundraising of scale. It's a pretty large scale fundraising. It works out to be, I think, about $130,000 at every school if you were to spread it across the district. So a lot more than what you would bring in with your membership dues, which is what National PTA is telling us. That should be our main source of income. That's clearly not the case. So the second question is, where is this money going? And based on the reporting that's in these documents, in these IRS Form 990 documents, the majority, not all, but more than half of this money is going directly into school budgets to subsidize public education. So $4 million of that $12 million went into actually paying for additional staff at schools. And aside from that, aside from staffing, this money also went into other school-related expenses like tutors, additional curriculum, which if you've ever paid for curriculum, it's very expensive. Classroom grants for teachers so that they're not buying supplies out of their own pockets. Additional programming, like one of the popular ones was additional elementary instrumental music time was a big one that year. And additional supplies for things like library programs, so library books. Until this year, there was no money set aside in the SPS budget for schools for library books. So PE supplies, if your PE teacher has particular supplies that they want or need to use, they will often come and ask PTA for that money. And music teachers, so things like that. So a lot of this money was going, and I can't give you an exact proportion again, because it's very difficult to put this together in a way that where you're comparing the same categories. But I would say as a ballpark, at least 2/3 of this money is going straight back into public schools. And that is, so that was the first leg, was, are we funding public education? That was the first thing that all the levels of PTA have been telling us that we shouldn't be doing. We shouldn't be funding public education, and we largely are with this money. The second thing that we were asked not to do was exacerbate existing inequities in our district, and I'm going to turn to that now. So this map shows the very high level breakdown of school. This is elementary school, only elementary schools, by race. And the blue pins represent schools at which the largest group of students by race was white students. And the orange pins represent schools where the largest group of students by race were a race other than white, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? I don't know if I explained that very clearly. Okay, stop me if it isn't making sense. So you can see that our district is pretty segregated. And again, this is because of the way I've sliced and diced it. It's not quite as simple as that. It isn't that all those schools are majority. A lot of the schools are majority white in the North End, but they're not necessarily majority white. It just means that they're a plurality of students. So the largest single group of students by race is white, and then vice versa for the South. So you can see that there's kind of a geographic split here in terms of racial representation in our district. And that's significant because this is, on the right here is a heat map of PTA fundraising in individual schools in our district that same year. This is all of the schools in the district. This isn't just elementary schools. So you will, if you're, I'll leave this up for a little while so you can look at both of them, and you'll see that there are blobs and dots in places where there are not pins on the other map. And if anybody has a question about any of them, please don't hesitate to ask. But again, I can't see the chat, so someone will need to read it to me. So I'll just give you a minute here to take a look at it. Okay. Oh, do we have any questions in the chat or anybody?
Not yet. People are either sitting on them or satisfied with your explanation so far.
Okay, so I'm hoping that you can see what I can see, which is
there is a question. Blobs versus pins. Can you say that one more time?
Oh, I just meant the circle. Some of the circles on the right-hand side are in places where you won't see a pin on the left-hand side, on the left-hand map. So the right-hand map has data that the left-hand map does not have. The left-hand map is just elementary schools. The right-hand map is elementary schools.
Okay, that's what I missed. Thank you.
Yeah, high schools, middle schools, yeah. It's all the different schools. But if you look at this map, you can see that there's kind of a pretty big area in which there are very, very small dots. And those very, very small dots are PTAs or PTOs that may have raised money. We don't know how much they may have raised. It may have been $5, $0, or it could have been $49,000. But the reporting threshold is $50,000. So if you brought in less than that, you don't report. So again, there is really no transparency into this process. So all we know is that those little tiny dots are schools who either don't have parent groups or whose parent groups did not bring in more than $49,999 that year. And they're pretty concentrated in the South End and then also in the far north, if you notice that. And the reason that that's significant or interesting, I guess, is you may or may not recognize the map on the left. This is what's called a redlining map. It was used in the 1930s through, 60s to assign risk for lending money to people to buy homes. And risk assessment was done by a firm that was engaged by the federal government. And they were given explicit instructions to mark as risky areas that were either racially mixed or minority white. So this map is theoretically a map of where it was riskiest for banks to lend money, where they were least likely to be paid back. It's also a map of the distribution of different races at that particular time in Seattle. So the green, the light, and the blue and dark blue areas were majority white neighborhoods, and the yellow and red areas were majority African American or other non-white communities. And you'll see that there are red areas there, and that's where the term redlining comes from. And the reason that's significant is because the ability to take out a mortgage which was something that was not possible before the 1930s, before the federal government introduced started to underwrite mortgages. That has been the primary source of wealth building, generational wealth building for families in this country. So if you lived in a red-lined or yellow-lined area, you were very unlikely to have access to that form of wealth building. And in a sense, the map on the right shows us the current results of that. That you will now find wealth in areas that were not, and it's not a one-to-one correspondence, obviously, but there is a pattern there. That wealth was built in areas where people had access to finance and was not built in areas where they did not. And that comes down to us today. So this is still relevant today. So this is, when you look at this map, you can see that there's kind of on its face racial inequity, because those smaller dots are associated with communities of color and low-income communities of color. And a lot of those schools are what's called Title I schools, and Title I schools are schools serving communities that are majority low income. And almost all of those schools in Seattle are serving mostly kids of color. And those schools are not fully funded either. So we know that this money is going into basic education costs. Mostly people will say because we don't have enough money in our schools, but those schools that have little tiny dots aren't fully funded either. So if we have the ability to fill public education gaps or gaps in public education funding in more affluent communities, then we are clearly creating a situation where we're exacerbating a racial inequity in those areas where that's not possible. Okay, I'll pause for questions. Okay, hearing none, I will continue. So the question that this raises, and I'm not the first person to notice this, and I did not come up with this. I came up with this map, but I didn't come up with this concept. And many people are concerned about this, and they know that they recognize that there is an inequity here. And yet it's very difficult to get anything to change. And when you ask folks why we can't change this practice, why can we not either dial back our fundraising or reduce our fundraising or share our funds. That is happening more often now, but folks will say, well, our schools are underfunded. And if we don't put money into our schools, then our kids will miss out. And there is a real fear that kids all over the city are going to be harmed if this process does not continue. And I hear that. And it's a very real fear, and I acknowledge that. And that feeds into how we need to approach this issue and this problem in order to come to a resolution that actually works for everybody. So I want to turn to the question of underfunding, because underfunding is the primary reason that people give for continuing this process, even when they know that it is inequitable. So first of all, it is important to know where funds for SPS come from. And as you may know, the primary source of funds for Seattle Public Schools is state and local income taxes. So together they account for almost 3/4 of the revenue that comes into SPS every year. There was, the last couple of years, there was a pretty huge bump that in that federal portion. So this is this year's funding sources. That federal portion was about double that for the last 2 years because of the rescue funding that came in from the federal government around the pandemic and the shutdowns. But it's close to pre-pandemic levels now. That funding is sort of done this. So there's a huge burst of funding, and then it's kind of phasing out. And Washington State actually now has a much higher proportion of its funds, of district funds, coming from the state rather than local taxation. That's something that came out of what's called the McCleary fix. People may know about. I'll talk a little bit about it later on, but anyway, suffice to say, we now have a larger proportion of funds that come into our district and other districts in the state come from the state government rather than from local taxes, which was not necessarily the case before. There was a bigger proportion that came from local taxes. That's now capped. There's a you can't go beyond a certain level anymore. Okay, so there is a perception that Washington State is very low on the list of states in terms of per student funding, and that certainly was the case not that long ago. Washington State was below the median for our nation in terms of funding per student. That is no longer the case. This is an incomplete map. This map is from the US Census Bureau. It's from an annual survey of school finance, I think it's called, and they survey every state and put together this document. It also, because everything that comes out of the US government is several years behind, so this is the most recent, and this isn't even a full data set. So the states there that are in gray are not reported on that graph. But I can tell you that none of them spend more per student than Washington does. And really the important data point here is that if you look around 2018, there was a pretty significant rise in funding around that time. So if you have had kids in the system for a while, my older child started in SPS in 2013. And at that time, there was a lot of talk about McCleary, which was the case that was brought against the state around underfunding of schools. And the state was in fact found to be drastically underfunding schools and was ordered to properly fund schools. There was a lot of back and forth about that. That case came down, I think, in 2012, I'm going to say, maybe 2013. And it took the state a very long time to actually get around to doing anything about that. But they did. They did actually infuse a pretty significant amount of money into the system. So while there is still a narrative floating around that we are really like lagging the rest of the country and we're severely underfunded, and I'm not making a claim about whether what we have is enough. It's just that relative to other states, we are not necessarily an outlier anymore. We're actually in the top quartile for spending per student. And then when you get a little closer to home, that same survey showed that in 2020, so again, this is lagging data because we don't have anything more recent, of the largest 100 school districts by enrollment. In 2020, the top 5 were these 5, and ours was number 5. And there is pretty significant difference between us and New York City, for example. And again, I'm not making any claims about whether this means that we have sufficient funds. I think it's just important for us to know where we're situated, because we do keep hearing this narrative about being outliers and being underfunded relative to other places. So we were in 2020 in the top 5, and we have increased. Even since then, our per student funding has increased. So just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the difference over time, and the difference that was created by the additional funding that the state legislature voted in 2018. Back in 2014, 2015, that school year, the amount allocated per student for Seattle Public Schools was $13,257. So around $13,000. In this year's budget, the spending per student is at $23,112. So from $13,000 to $23,000 in just a couple of years. Again, not making claims about adequacy, but just showing you that there has been an influx of cash into our public schools in the last few years. And then the last thing I wanted to show you was this interesting graph, because one of the things that if you're in a PTA in a more affluent community, your PTA is often, oh, we have a question?
Yep. You saw me go off mute. You're so quick. The question from the last graph, one friend asked, is that for all schools? Another question is about, does this include charter schools? So another kind of, is it for all schools, charter schools, and NPA or non-public school systems? Has anyone done this ranking with consideration to cost of living? So
yes, that has, well, this is
in a row.
That has been done. The only thing I can tell you about that is that this particular year, Seattle was not ranked 5th for cost of living, but it wasn't that much lower. So yes. And that's a great question. I don't have the answer to that at my fingertips. It's out there. There was a question about
if the graph, I think prior, I missed that in the chat.
Oh,
I was listening so closely.
Oh, does that include everything?
It's all schools.
Public schools, charter schools are public schools. They're publicly funded. So that would include charter schools, I assume. That would be my assumption. Was there another question that I missed? No. Okay. Did that answer?
My question was actually when you were talking about how SPS funds per students, is that across the board?
Yeah, that's across all schools. Yes. So there's obviously variation. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, so each student is funded the same, no matter what school you go to? No.
No. I'm talking about if you take the entire budget and you divide by the number of students we have. Yes. No, there is wide variation in funding per student at the school level. Yes.
Okay.
For sure. Where was I? Oh yeah. So this graph, which was done by a group called the Edunomics Lab, which is actually here in Seattle, and all they do is school finance. They came up with this graph that shows the relationship between enrollment and staffing in SPS. And this is total staff, it's not just teachers. Most of it did not go downtown. There's a perception that our district administration is massively overstaffed. It's actually pretty much at the average. It's about 6% of total staff, and that's the average across the country. Again, not making any kind of value judgments there, but just those are the numbers. And so most of these employees were either, and I actually have this information if anyone's interested in it. I just figured I was already at too many slides. So, but those additional people were mostly IAs, so instructional assistants, special ed teachers, some classroom teachers, mostly people working in buildings with kids. So, and some like service workers, so maintenance workers, people like that. But so there has been a significant increase in staffing that has not necessarily tracked our enrollment. And at the same time, PTAs are actually being asked for more money than ever before. And I want to just be very clear in that principals should not be asking PTAs for money. That's never appropriate, but I know it happens. And in 2014-15, so I mentioned before in 2014-15, and again, those figures are not adjusted for inflation. Obviously, inflation is important right now. They're not adjusted in any way, so they're not necessarily as drastic as they sound. And again, I offer this information just as information, just to put it out there. It needs to be refined. I'm not using it to make an argument. I just want to share it as information. But yeah, at that point, when we had spending of $13,000 per student across the board, the average ask of PTAs, the average amount that PTAs were spending, again, spread out across the district, which is not how that spending is spread out, was about $75 per student. And this year it was $84 per student. So rather than going down with this additional funding and additional people in the building, it's actually going up. And I also want to be really clear that I'm not saying that schools aren't underfunded. What I will say shortly is that we don't actually know what the situation is, but we do know that there is underfunding in specific areas, and two of those right now that are hot topics are special education. There is a cap, as you may know, on special education funding. The state will reimburse you for up to 13.5% of, I always have trouble explaining this, if more than 13.5% of your students have IEPs and are in your special education program, you don't get funded for anything beyond that. So there's a cap at 13.5%. So if as in SPS, we have, I think this year it's 15.5% of our students have IEPs, we still only get funded for 13.5% of them. So that's a known and clear area in which there is underfunding. And another area is transportation reimbursement. So there's a very complicated, weird, regressive reimbursement formula for transportation that I will not even go into, but that is a problem. And those two things are problems for districts across the state, not just for SPS. And they're often even more dire in other districts that have higher proportions of their kids with IEPs. And I know rural districts have a lot of trouble with transportation. They're transporting kids over a wide area, but a small number of kids. So it's often even worse for them. But those are areas. So I'm not for a second suggesting that we don't have problems. There are definitely problems, even though there is theoretically more money in the system. And then the last thing I wanted to show was this handy little graphic that was produced by, I think, Senate Legislative Support Services, that shows you, this is sort of the universe of funding at the state level. And this is the state's general fund. There's three funds, as I recall. There's the general fund, the capital fund, and the transportation fund. The general fund is by far the biggest. That's pretty much where most of the money for the state operations comes from. And if you look at this, it shows you, I love the way this is set up. I think it's the best graphics I've seen in terms of explaining information that I've ever seen. But it shows the relative sizes of the budgets of different parts of the state apparatus. And you will see that K-12 public schools is a huge planet out there. It's actually almost 50% of state general funding goes to, and again, that's the bulk of state funds is in the general fund. So a really massive proportion of state funding is going into K-12 schools. And that's important. I'm going to turn in a minute talking about advocacy. When we talk about advocacy and we talk about underfunding, when we have that conversation, we often come to, well, we all need to go down to Olympia and ask for more money. And when you go down to Olympia, they will show you all of those graphs I just showed you and this picture. And they'll say, yeah, no. So we need to get a little more nuanced and refined about what we're advocating for when we advocate. And that is what I want to turn to now. And I promise I'm almost done. So, and this is the part that I think is going to leave you with more questions than answers. And I hope that it will. And I hope that it will inspire you to go out and see if you can dig up some answers and share them. So these are just based on what I've been talking about here, based on some of the work that I've done around SPS budgeting. These are the questions that come up for me when I hear people say our schools are underfunded and that's why we have to raise private money to put into public schools. First of all, we don't really know a whole lot about school spending. Until 2018, schools were not required to report actual spending anywhere. So you can get SPS budgets back to forever. And people will often look at the budget book, which is published on the website every year, and say, well, this school got this much and this school got that. Those aren't real numbers. Those are, if you've ever made a budget, you put together your budget. I think I'm going to spend this much, and I think I'm going to spend this much. Then at the end of the year, if you're really on it, which I never am, you'll look at your actual spending and compare it to your budget. And often there'll be really big differences between what you budgeted in one category and what you spent. And there's pretty significant reasons for thinking that there is a big difference between what is budgeted by SPS and what is spent, partly because of the way the information that's used to make that budget is not actual spending information. I will not get into that. It's complicated. But we don't really have a lot of insight into how the money was spent. So nowhere do they publish actual spending. They have to report that to the state now. Actually, the most recent data we have, and the only data we have right now, is from that same school year, 2018-19. So you can actually now go and find a lovely scatter graph that shows you actual per student spending at every school in our district. It doesn't break down into any categories. You can't look inside it. You get one number. So you can't tell like how much of that went to special education, how much went to kids who are in the multilingual program, how much went to general education. Like, there is no insight into that. So we don't really know how that money is being spent. All we can do is compare that gross number. You know, this school was allocated X amount and it spent Y amount. So we need more transparency around actual spending. How does our school district actually spend money at our schools? There's reason to believe there's a big difference between how much is allocated for staff and how much is spent. Again, I won't go into it, but we don't have that information anywhere. And we also need transparency around PTA inputs, because as I mentioned before, there really isn't any standardized reporting of that information anywhere. So even as PTAs, we don't know what that money is doing. And that's important as a nonprofit organization to know where your money is going, because if you don't spend your money, if you don't allocate money or disperse money in a way that furthers your mission, the IRS will start asking questions and you can lose your 501c3 status. So we need transparency around all of these things. The next question that the budget data raised for me is our district structured efficiently and in the most effective way to improve student outcomes? And well, I'll keep going. So in our district, resources follow adults. They do not follow students. When the district budgets, but sends out school level budgets in March, they use a thing called the weighted staffing standards formula. And the way that works is it assigns adults to school buildings. They don't, there's a work group that comes up with, tweaks that formula every year. That work group does not sit down and say, how can we best take the resources we have and apply them in a way that will improve student outcomes this year or lead to better student outcomes? They sit down and they say, what are our obligations under our labor agreements and state law? And that's how the resources are rolled out. So they're pretty much focused on adults. And I'm not talking about people's individual level desire to improve student outcomes. I'm just saying, like, structurally, that's the way it works. It's not that people don't want to improve student outcomes, it's that they are bound by these particular things to allocate resources in a certain way. There are other ways to allocate resources. There's a model called weighted student funding, where the resources actually do follow the students. Our district used to use that, and they stopped doing it. They used it for about 10 years back in the 90s and early 2000s, and then that was abolished in 2008, I'm going to say. Okay, the next thing about the way we allocate resources and distribute resources is that there is really no flexibility for moving those resources around at the building level. So if you are familiar at all with the budget process in SPS, for example, if you've been on your school's building leadership team, you'll know that come March, your school principal will get a little sheet of paper that says this is how many people will be in your building. And then it's the building leadership team's job which is a committee made up of mostly teachers and the principal and sometimes parents. And their job is to figure out how to allocate the resources in that document in a way that is most beneficial to students. But the reality is that there's rarely any give. There's rarely any flexibility in what's given, which is where PTA funding comes into play. PTA money becomes this source of flexible resourcing because PTA money has no strings attached. So the demand for PTA funding is sometimes not as much a reflection of a lack of resources, but a lack of flexible resources. So there may be a need in a building that cannot be met, not because the people aren't there, but because they can't be used that way. Because in a contract somewhere or in a state law somewhere, it says, no, that person has to be used this way. So there isn't anybody for that, even though that would be more beneficial to students. That's when you'll see schools often ask for PTA money, because they're like, we can't use what we have in the way that we need to. So we need a source of funds that we can use in this way. So PTA funding is often sought because it's better for students in a sense, but not because the resources aren't there. It's because they can't be used in the way that they're needed. The other problem that I see is that there is no ROI's return on investment. And I hate to use business terms in education, but any organization does to run well. It's kind of a basic requirement that you look at the way you're spending money and the outcomes that you're getting for it, and making sure that you use that money in a way that leads to the outcomes that you are seeking. We don't do that. And this is not just Seattle Public Schools. This is schools across the school districts across the country. There isn't a cultural habit of looking at data outcomes and trying to tie them to spending. Like, we paid for program X. Did it lead to the outcomes we want? That no one is collecting the data. They're not putting, or if they are, they're not putting it together with the funding. So we are making funding decisions by default. So right now, for example, one of the things that we're spending a lot of money on is having lots and lots of little tiny elementary schools. And I know people are really protective of their schools, and I appreciate that. One of my kids is at a really tiny elementary school, and it's a wonderful school. But if you zoom out a little bit, there are interventions that are great for kids and interventions that aren't so great for kids, and interventions that are kind of worth the money and interventions that aren't. And a small school isn't shown to be a particularly effective intervention that leads to better outcomes for kids. There are other ways we could spend that money that would actually improve student outcomes more than having all these little schools. That's just one example. And then,
can I ask, there is a question in the chat about why did the student standard for allocating change to a weighted staff standard? Why did we move to the WSS?
oh boy. Okay, I'll try to give the potted version as I understand it. In about 25 years ago, when John Stanford was the superintendent, he came in and decentralized the school district. It was a very centralized sort of bureaucracy before that. And the prevailing theory of school district management at that time was this thing called site-based management. And the idea was that the people closest to the students were best positioned to make decisions about how to set the school up. So at that point, there was a very radically new collective bargaining agreement with the labor union at the time that decentralized decision-making and pushed it out to schools. And as part of that decentralization, that was when building leadership teams came into being, that they were created during that period, because that was supposed to be the body that would make those decisions at the building level. And one of the things that they were tasked with was budgets. And unlike now, where principals get a list of FTE, so people time, at that point, they got money. And they were told, here's your pot of money based on this weighted student formula, which took into account the students that you had at your school. There's so much more to it, partly because they got rid of busing. They had cross-district busing for racial integration that was going away. There was an awareness at the district level that the schools would resegregate. And so they needed to have a formula that would differentiate between schools based on the students that were in the schools. So they began to attach the funding to the students who were actually in the schools. And then that money that was generated through that formula went to the school in the form of money. And then the school had to figure out how to spend that money in a way that would be most effective for their students. That was the idea. Very rapidly became obvious that neither principals nor teachers were trained to do that. And I don't believe they got a whole lot of training, and it became very time consuming. And there was still those labor agreements and state laws that really hamstrung the way that they could use that money. So there was kind of a consensus that it was a waste of time. that there was so little that they could do with that money because it was kind of pre-spent in a sense, that they didn't want that responsibility. So that got pulled back, and the weighted student formula at the same time. I'm not entirely sure how they were related, but it happened at the same time. That responsibility was pulled back from schools, and then the district switched to this weighted staffing standard. So they're just like, okay, well, your school has 300 kids in it, you get X. Well, your school has 700 kids in it, you get Y. And it was just this very, there wasn't a lot of just, it didn't require anywhere near as much work at the building level. So that's as much as I know. All right. And my last observation is that in some ways our district, and if you think back to that kind of universe picture that I showed you with all the planets on it, one of the things that's happening is that our district and our education system in general is being required to provide social services to students as well as an education. So if kiddos come to school without breakfast, they can't learn. And so then schools suddenly become responsible for feeding kids. So nutrition and I think you can tell from my accent that I'm not from here originally. As a foreigner, the idea of school food is not one that was familiar to me when I first moved here. But I think for folks who grew up here, it feels natural that schools would provide food. It's not necessarily, that's a social service function that other agencies of the state are already paid and funded to provide. Another example is during the pandemic. Even though we have a county public health department and a city public health department, SPS was required to essentially set up a standalone internal public health department to run all of the COVID precautions and testing and all of the stuff that was happening in the schools during when we went back last year, without any real help or support from the public health agencies that exist. So often when we hear that we need X, Y, Z in our schools, we may need those services in our schools, but we may not need funding for those services. We may need the other parts of the state to provide those services instead of kind of half funding those services in schools and expecting schools to carry out those, to provide those services at the same time. I know that's a lot of information in a very short time, and I haven't really gone into any of these, but basically my aim is to show that while underfunding is not an inaccurate way of thinking about why PTAs are asked for money and why we do this, and why we feel like we can't stop. It's not the whole answer, and that we have a lot more questions that we need to start asking before we really know what we need to go to the legislature and ask for. So that is all I have. Oh, this is actually my final question, is for us to really solve this problem, the problem of the inequity that's caused by PTA fundraising and the fact that we're being asked to do it at all, is we need to ask ourselves if we actually have the will to act as a community for all of our students, because it's only by using our funds as a community, the resources that we get already as a community, that we can create the best system, the best outcomes for all of our kids, rather than focusing on our little silos. Because when we're divided, we have very little power. But when we come together and unite, if we speak with one voice, then we have a whole lot of power and we can change things. And that's it.
I love this. Thank you, Vivian. I'm going to stop recording. And while I'm doing